On this day, the 11th of January 1946, Enver Hoxha deposed King Zog of Albania and proclaimed the People's Republic of Albania. This would begin a 40-year reign for the communist leader, who would lead Albania into being one of the most isolated, backward and poorest parts of Europe. Enver Hoxha first became a member of the Communist Party in 1941. At the time, Albania was under Italian occupation and World War II was happening. In neighbouring Yugoslavia, there was serious resistance to German and Italian occupation. This was led by Tito and the Communists, and on the other side by the Royalists. Eventually they started fighting each other as well as the German and Italians, and they were very influential towards the Albanians. This led to the Albanian partisans under the leadership of Hoxha joining the Yugoslav partisans in making life difficult for the Italians and Germans in that area. The Italians wanted to annex Albania as well as Kosovo and small parts of modern-day Macedonia to create a big client state that would eventually be Italianized, part of Mussolini's drive for empire. The Albanians didn't really like this, and so Hoxha led the communists to fight the Italians in Albania. Now, the Albanian communists had this idea that the Italian puppet state, which included Kosovo and parts of Macedonia, which was filled with ethnic Albanians, that should be the Albania that became independent after the war. It's been a dream for a long time for many Albanian political types to want to have this greater Albania. And during the war he discussed this with Tito, and at first Tito was busy fighting. He's like, yeah, we'll talk about it later. Eventually it got to the point where much of Yugoslavia had been liberated from Axis occupation. At this point, Tito actually could have a serious conversation or discussion with the Albanians. Basically said, no, because if I do that, the Serbs are going to go mad. You need to keep the Serbs on side, and he wasn't just going to give over a chunk of Serbia to Albania. This ended up to a falling out that ended up getting worse and worse as the years went by with the Yugoslav partisans. Now, in 1944, the Italians had collapsed in Albania, and the Albanian partisans liberated Tirana on the 29th of November 1944. Hoxha was made interim prime minister, and King Zog, strange name for a king, but King Zog was barred from coming back home. Now, after this, Albanian partisans and troops were sent into Yugoslavia to help Tito drive the last Germans out of Yugoslavia. Tito was very grateful for this and thanked Hoxha. Now, in August 1945, since after the wars ended, there was an election, the first election in quite a long time. And they had this Democratic Front, which was basically the communists, with a few maybe other kind of left-leaning people involved. And they were the only people allowed to run. And they got 93% of the vote, so it was a landslide of epic proportions. Amazing what happens when you ban the other parties. So then that ended up with him being in control. He ended up being the most powerful man in Albania, and now he could declare his people's republic. Hoxha ruled Albania for 39 years. There are some kings and emperors who do not reign for as long as that. And he had some good points. He helped rebuild Albania from the ruins that lay in 1945. He got the first railway line built in Albania. Literacy went from 5% to 90% under his rule. Local epidemics were ended. The electrification of Albania began. He achieved agricultural independence, which isn't as good as it sounds. It probably means breadlines, but he did try to get to the point where they didn't need any imports. He outlawed religion. He outlawed traveling abroad. He outlawed people coming into the country. He outlawed private ownership. He closed or converted all religious facilities to secular use. He executed thousands and put tens of thousands in labor camp. Now, granted, Albania was small, has small population, but by the standard of a communist, that wasn't too bad. He wasn't a Pol Pot. He didn't kill half his country. So I suppose that's a tick. What's interesting is he started off as a Stalinist, a big fan, huge fan of Stalin. And this would cause problems, because Tito very quickly fell out with Stalin. He wanted to be in charge of his own country. Stalin didn't occupy Yugoslavia. They couldn't really, because the Yugoslavians were too powerful, too experienced, so they couldn't. So Tito was pretty free to do what he wanted. And then there was the break in 1948 with the Soviet Union, which left Albania in a strange position. He cut off all relations with Yugoslavia, and he had many people within his own party purged if he thought they were pro-Yugoslav, pro-Tito. Many were killed, sent to camps, tortured until they confess, that sort of thing, the usual. And he ended up being completely cut off, because he closed the border with Yugoslavia, completely cut off from the Eastern Bloc. So if he wanted anything, any sort of travel or communication with the Soviet Union, he'd have to go by boat, because he couldn't go through the horrible capitalist thing, part of the world. He couldn't go through Yugoslavia to get to Bulgaria, Romania. So that was that. Albania was going to be isolated for the rest of its time as a communist state. So once that happened, he remained very faithful to Stalin, big fanboy, and Stalin didn't really care. Like, he honestly didn't care about Albania one bit. He even suggested to Tito, before they fell out, you should just absorb Albania. What's the point of having a tiny little communist country? Just make it part of Yugoslavia. He had no regard for Hoxha or Albania, didn't care one bit about it. And he wasn't going to go to war for it, so the Allies probably could have gone in and just invaded it anyway, and he wouldn't have cared. Anyway, so he's a big Stalin fanboy, and then when Stalin was denounced in the Soviet Union, he was really angry. And he at that point turned to Mao and Maoism. And Albania and China became best buds. And he wanted to imitate Mao. Thankfully, he didn't imitate him as much as he could have, because there wasn't, 5% of the population dying of starvation. But his big thing was to be a Maoist. Now, that was great up until 1971, where suddenly China started being pally with the Americans. Again, Hoxha was disgusted. He denounced Mao, denounced China, and now he was by himself. So, for the last decade of his life, Albania was really isolated. They hated Yugoslavia and Tito and Titoism. They hated the Soviet Union and its reform and its de-Stalinization. And they hated Maoist China for being traitors and going to the Americans. So, yeah, for the last decade, Albania was in a miserable state. He finally died in 1985, and in 1989, 1990, everything changed. Albania got rid of the communists, although many of the communists ended up becoming criminals. And that's where all these Albanian mafia types originated, coming from the state security apparatus of Albania and the Communist Party of Albania, because they had all the contacts, they had all the guns, they had all the knowledge, and yeah, so we have Hoxha to thank for the Albanian mafia. A very strange country, Albania. It was even stranger when Hoxha ruled it. So on this day, the 11th of January 1946, Enver Hoxha proclaimed the People's Republic of Albania. Come back tomorrow for more. If you like these videos, like, subscribe and leave a comment.